The Holy Gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ according to St. Matthew.
Glory to you, Lord Christ.
When the Pharisees heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. "Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest?" He said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment, and a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets." Now, while the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them a question. "What do you think of the Messiah? Whose son is he?" They said to him, "The son of David." He said to them, "How is it then that David by the Spirit calls him Lord, saying, 'The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand, until I put your enemies under your feet'? If David thus calls him Lord, how can he be his son?" No one was able to give him an answer. Nor from that day did anyone dare to ask him any more questions. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
In the name of the living God, Creator, Redeemer, and Sanctifier. Amen. Please be seated, everyone. Oh, I am about to share a tale of my childhood. A brief one. Is it my wife who just made that? You have to understand, and of course I'm appreciating my age this week in particular, but when I was a child, there were a lot of variety shows. Those of you at least my age know that. A lot of variety shows on television. There was Ed Sullivan, there was Hollywood Palace, oh that was a good one. There were all sorts of things, and they always seemed to feature, at least in every episode and every presentation, I don't know what's called, a lounge singer. Someone would come out and sing one or more of the American standards. You know, those glorious songs that I loved as a child, I love now, and that, remarkably, I knew as a child. Because my parents had records in the basement on the hi-fi. And I would listen to sing, and I really used to enjoy that. My grandfather, who was a character, whose grandfather is it, you know, when you think about it? My grandfather was a character who used to, on those occasions when he would babysit for me, which he loved to do, he would occasionally hand me one of my dad's unlit cigarettes and a glass of apple juice, and at the age of 5, have me singing, you know, the American standard to the record player. He thought that was the funniest thing ever, but I'm not so sure it was not so much as the reaction of my grandmother when she walked in and saw me with a cigarette. Might have been a glass of something. I should point out, my grandmother, who as a young woman was a member of the Glasgow Temperance League. But I've always loved that music. I know it well. I sometimes sing hymns according to a Vegas beat. We'll talk about that, John. But I find myself getting sucked into the great black hole of YouTube sometimes because I want to hear some music, and now that you can take something on a computer and run it through some really nice speakers, well, we know about that here. You can hear it rather wonderfully, and sometimes you'll look up American standards and you'll find somebody's interpretation of a particular song, which is always fun, you know, and then you go to someone else who has a different arrangement and a different interpretation and a different emphasis. And the other day I was listening to this fellow, and he was singing "My Foolish Heart." Yeah, that's a classic, a really ancient, classic American standard. And suddenly, in the middle of it, he started singing something that wasn't according to the tune of "My Foolish Heart." And I kind of caught it. He had an interesting voice. He was a baritone, but I think about a 5-octave range baritone. And it was almost a chant set in the middle of this American standard song. And I recognized it. not right away, something in my brain was tickled. I knew those words. I'd heard them before somewhere. They are not part of American Standard Classic Songs, but there we have it. Thank heaven we live in the age of the search engine, because that's one of those things that would bother me for months until it finally occurred to me, or until I finally forgot it. And I looked it up, and there, lo and behold, smack dab in the middle of this American Standard song, he had inserted a poem written by St. John of the Cross, one of the better-known Christian mystics, right there in the middle of a lounge song. It fit beautifully, by the way. And it made me a little curious about the singer. I discovered that, in fact, he had attended the University of Chicago Divinity School. So, okay. Why did he become a singer? You know, the big money's in church. But clearly, it had some effect on it. And I thought, that's sort of the glorious thing about it. You know, that's what Jesus always tries to highlight. Is this understanding that the common or commonplace or the mundane or the worldly can coexist with the spiritual. The two interpenetrate. Because you know, Jesus is always about this kind of micro spirituality. Everybody else wants to talk about the past and the future. Jesus wants to talk about today. Everyone else, like the Pharisees and what have you, want to talk about these vast understandings of a great culture throughout history, and Jesus pretty much wants to talk about what one person can do with another person. It's micro-spirituality. Because when it's realized at that level, that's the spiritual, of course, but it's also the commonplace. God is revealed most mightily when we're doing something that appears to be rather mundane. We're driving to work. We are fixing something around the house that we had fixed just last month, it seemed. We are throwing something in the washing machine. We're digging out some really weird stuff that's got caught in the washing machine. And it occurs to us. There's something about this. There's something about this day. There's something about our life. And this whole aspect is aggravating the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Herodians and all of those groups and all the groups within groups, because, you know, they're looking at the big picture. The big picture always includes them in power, by the way. They're looking at the big picture and their longevity. They have a good deal. They have a good, one might say, a good grift going. And they don't want anything to mess it up. And Jesus has come along, and what is this business he's talking about? The here and now, person to person? What? We're talking this massive picture, so they come to him. And you know what they're trying to do? They're trying to hang a sign on him. They're trying to put a name to him. They're trying to understand what he is. The possibilities, of course, are endless. Is he some sort of incorrigible troublemaker? Is he some innovative, weirdo? Is he a rebel? Is he a heretic? Is he a blasphemer? Is he a challenge to our authority? Is he possibly a harbinger of the end of our authority and all of the comforts that go with it? Is he these things? And so they meet with him and they ask him, and you've been hearing it Sunday after Sunday, they ask him these big picture questions about all these portions of Scripture and the law and the prophets and all of this, and it reaches its point of absurdity. If you thought it was absurd last week when they're even violating their own teaching to see if they can get Jesus to violate their teaching, what? That's, they're almost incomprehensible at this point. They're so wrapped up in trying to catch him in something, they're violating it themselves. But it doesn't matter. It'll work if we get him this time. And so now finally they ask him a question, which is, again, a complete, if not violation, misunderstanding of what the law is about. I know we learn the law as the Ten Commandments. We learn them as 10 fragments of a greater whole. But in fact, it's best if you want to see this as did a Jew, and as was taught in the first century, and probably is pretty much taught these days too in Judaism. And as a way we should really see it as Christians, the 10 Commandments aren't 10 Commandments. The law, consider it this way, is one eccentrically punctuated sentence. The law is one thing. The commandments are one thing. It's a commandment. All of it is thematic. All of it is about the interpenetration of the commonplace with the spiritual. Here's what you do during the day. Here's how you integrate God into that experience. Here's how we cooperate within a society today to make sure everything stays together today. And here's how we bring God into that conversation. Do I meet God sometime in the future? Good for you. That's not what this is about. Do I meet God today? This moment? This second? Perfect. This is what it's about. And so they ask him this question, which basically invites him to again, violate their own teaching as they are violating their own teaching and break apart the law. Well, which part of the law is best? Which part of the law works best? Which can you take it out? And so Jesus gloriously summarizes it nicely with those two strong points. Here, is the law too many sentences for you? All right, here. You know what it is? Love God. Love everybody else. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Every single thing in Hebrew history, in Jewish history, and honestly, we can say in vital Christian history, every single one of those things is based on that understanding. Love God strongly. Love one another strongly. Figure out how you wish to be regarded and regard other people in that manner. And that is not something you have to put off to some future date, to some reckoning with God and reckoning with the kingdom or any of those things. That's something you can do now, here and now, ready to go. Know God now. And Jesus then asks them the most single, wonderfully absurd and impenetrable question in all of the Gospels. Because he's lampooning them. He's not being so cruel as to mock them. He is showing them the increasing absurdity of their questioning and their remarkable inability to hear the answers. Because with each one of these moments where Jesus is challenged, you will notice the subsequent question has already been answered by the subsequent answer. And so they're building upon this and building upon this, and they're not listening to his answers at all. And sometimes they can't even comprehend them. And so here, this is the ultimate moment. Let me ask you a question. And he asks them one of those vexatious questions learned in rabbi debate school, which was part of the teaching, actually, the young Jewish men. They taught them how to debate. And they would ask absurd questions and see if they could work their way through it with an answer that was perhaps not absurd. And Jesus seizes upon the most absurd question of all. I mean, really, it's almost incomprehensible, and it doesn't matter. It's not about the answer, it's about the reaction from the Pharisees. And what's their reaction? They can't answer it. To the extent that, I don't know about you, Brother Pharisee, but I'm not asking this guy any more questions. He keeps asking us hard questions. We can't have this. We're supposed to ask him hard questions. We're the Pharisees. And he tangles them up in knots, and that's it. That's how absurd their reasoning has become. That's how desperate they are to accuse him of something, to catch him in something. They have now multiple times violated their own teaching, violated the law. Well, they're allowed to do that, they're Pharisees. And they have attempted to capture him in all of this. And Jesus, once again, this is what you sound like. This is what your questions sound like. Not just to me, but to all these people. Look at all these disciples. Look at these curiosity seekers. Look at this throng. They're not going to you for teaching. In most cases, you aren't allowed to teach them, but they're coming to me. They're coming to hear it from me, and in particular, they're coming to hear it today, now. How can you achieve the kingdom now, this moment? How can you know God this moment? How can you embrace all of eternity in this particular moment? And how can I do it from person to person? The exchange they have, the meals they share, the welcomes they give to one another, all those things. It's all happening. And the Pharisees really just needed to answer some obtuse question or two so they could punish him, so they could hang a sign on him, so they could put a label to him, and by extension, put a label on his followers so that they might then be given some silly title which would encourage the Pharisees to simply dismiss them as an historic reality. That's it. Okay. Well, they're just this X. We can just call them that. I notice some of that sort of exists in contemporary society. By the way, this is just an aside, but I noticed for example, the definition of the word fascism or fascist has broadened considerably. Basically, it's if you disagree with me, you're a fascist. That covers a lot of ground. For the Pharisees, it's like, well, if you disagree with us, clearly you're not a Jew, and you're something we should dismiss. And it's just not working. Because no one's going to the Pharisees any longer for teaching. They aren't interested in what happened 100 years before or 1,000 years before as much as they are interested in what's happening now. They're not interested in waiting for some return of the Messiah when a lot of them, I'm sure, are beginning to suspect, and rather strongly, that the one who's teaching them all this wonder, which is not born out of innovation, but is in fact taken out of that great treasure chest of Jewish theology, is in fact the Messiah himself. And his words are carrying a power and a knowledge and an understanding that is far beyond the academic arguments of the Pharisees. That's the dangerous thing. When Moses is being mourned in today's reading from Deuteronomy, there's that glorious final verse that we heard this morning. Let's see. God and Moses knew one another face to face. That has one meaning nowadays, especially in this world of Zoom meetings and those other things. But originally, from the Hebrew, that expression meant God and Moses saw something of the other in one another. God saw something of God in Moses. Moses saw something of God in God. I think I tangled that up, but you can. They saw something within one another that was shared. And that's what Jesus is teaching in all of these responses, all these answers, and shortly within his own body, and the humiliation that he will suffer through that body, and then eventually through that glorious resurrection. Those are all the things that are being taught. We share with God, God shares with us. We see God face to face. God sees us face to face. That is the glory that is enabled. It is one thing in the Old Testament for Moses to be the one, the only one to be able to do that. But Jesus brings that ability to us all. And that's what so violates all the teaching and causes all the gnashing of teeth that's going on. And the one thing, the one kernel, the one gloriousness that we can take away from all of these challenges to Jesus is the fact that we are as close to God now as we can ever be. All that is required, really, in this relationship is building it upon those two glorious portions of thematic commandment. Love God to the best of your ability and to the best of your understanding of what love might mean in this celestial sense. And love everyone else, even when that's a challenge. Even when you feel as if you do not know God well enough to love God anyway. And even when you feel as if you're surrounded by people who challenge your notion of love, or when you behave in such a way that challenges others' notion of love, nevertheless, love. And everything else falls into place, the past, the future, and in particular the moment. And when we can do that, the face of the commonplace and the face of the spiritual meet and join and interpenetrate. And we are liberated, not at some future date. We are liberated now.